Okay, I'm now going to come back to a couple of questions from Russia. These are actually from Russian officials here in the United States. The first question says, Mr. LaRouche, as I'm sure you're aware, there is a major and very unfortunate effort in Russia to attempt to provoke Mr. Medvedev to take decisive anti-Putin action. This campaign is being run largely through the British press. The basis for this is a so-called anti-corruption campaign in Russia. And I must say that this is incredibly ironic, because the fact of the matter is that the line that is being pushed is that Russia would in fact enjoy an unlimited stream of money from abroad if only the Kremlin could clean up corruption. The argument is absurd on many fronts. First of all, money is already streaming into Russia because of the very high price of oil. But what is very notable about this is that our finance minister, Mr. Kudrin, has in fact sequestered all of these funds and has insisted that they not be invested in the economy. His reason for this? Corruption. Interestingly, this is something of a repeat of money that flowed into Russia in the earlier part of it's not clear what years he's talking about. He says, but this is something of a repeat of what happened in the past when money that came in was sequestered in what was called a stabilization fund. And I would like to point out that that stabilization fund was never invested in the Russian economy, but instead it was used to bail out Russian banks and corporations. You might think that that in itself would help the Russian economy, but it did not, because the bailout of those banks and corporations had one goal only, and that was to enable them to meet their debt obligations to financiers that were centered largely in London and on Wall Street. Unfortunately, right now, it does appear that President Medvedev has bought into the corruption argument or the anti-corruption argument. Our question to you is the following. Since these people are clearly the corrupt ones, would it not be to our advantage to say, yes, we too support a campaign of anti-corruption in the Kremlin, and then identify exactly who those corrupt elements are and essentially launch internal war against them?
From the case of Nikita Khrushchev in the post-Stalin period on, the problem in Russia and the Soviet Union and Russia today has been British. Now, this is not unusual because the penetration of Russia by British influence goes back to the early part of the 19th century. So it's a new process. It was going on in Marx's time. Marx was actually part of a support, diplomatic support for the destruction of Russia, because Marx at that time was working as a British agent. He'd been employed by the guy, his master, who brought him into Britain. He'd been employed for British intelligence for the operations in Europe. He was actually Marx was appointed through the Foreign Office, and of which he was a tool. It was for a number of operations, such as founding operations in Italy and elsewhere. And of course, Marx didn't know what he was doing. He had a big ego, and therefore imagined he was doing things that are quite different than he was actually doing. But he was brought into Britain, into the British Foreign Office Service, and worked there, and was a British agent up to the time that of the end of the 60s in Russia. Then he was discarded after the failure of the French Commune, and that they dumped him then. However, Engels remained as a British agent and was responsible for these funny kinds of things up until the time of his death in the 1890s. Engels had been a British agent all the time, and that's why some of the confusion goes. Now, the other side of this thing is that's not the end of it. The key intelligence figure in coordinating British intelligence operations against the Soviet Union in particular was Bertrand Russell. And Bertrand Russell struck a deal with Khrushchev, 4 representatives of Khrushchev, at a meeting in London of Russell's World Parliamentarians for World Government. The other key instrument of British influence in the Soviet Union and Russia today is the International Institute for Applied Systems Analysis, which is a British intelligence operation spawned out of the Cambridge School, Russell's Cambridge School of Systems Analysis. And the policies of Russia today of this nature are largely run through the office in Austria of that institution of the International Institute for Applied Systems Analysis, which is a monetarist operation, which I've dealt with in earlier times back in the 1970s and later. It's a rotten institution, and it's tied to the Club of Rome. It's part of the same operation. And it's tied to the dirtiest people in Wall Street as well. So what's happened is that a systematic effort has been made to bring Russia today under the control of Anglo-American influences, with strong emphasis on the British. And the central systematic feature of this thing, apart from the British Foreign Office generally, is the operations run on economic policy through the Institute for Applied Systems Analysis based outside of Vienna. That's how the thing is run. So if we understand that, and you understand what British monetarism is, and you look at the number of, going back to, say, for Andropov. Andropov is typical of this. Andropov, from the time of the Hungarian Revolution, had changed his career direction in the Soviet service and became, marched all the way up to his position as a chief of intelligence, internal intelligence and so forth, in Russia, but was created at the time, from about that time of the Hungarian Revolution, began to recruit young Russian scientifically trained people into becoming British agents. What he did, he would send them to universities in Britain, chiefly. And there they would be trained in British economic policy. And then they were shipped back into Russia, especially after the fall of the wall. They were shipped back into Russia as being key agents, especially in economic policy, in coordination with people like George H.W. Bush, and therefore after. So that's your problem there. The problem is largely you have, Gorbachev was part of the same thing. Obviously British agents. And it's known. I mean, in Russia, Gorbachev is despised because he's treated by senior people as a traitor to his country. They consider some other things who made foolish mistakes, but the Russians, patriots, do distinguish between people they consider as having been traitors as opposed to those who have been merely fooled. But this was the case with Gorbachev is that. Gorbachev is constantly running to London. And Gorbachev is, one of the factors, a complicating factor here, of course, is that the very fact that the Gorbachev stink is put on the campaign against Putin, is one of the biggest advantages of Putin, political advantages of Putin. if Gorbachev's name and face shows up on a campaign against Putin, it's not going to be good for that side. The Russians, who remember, hate this guy, and I despise him, frankly.